Welcome to Love Books. It's wonderful to have such a full shop here tonight. Thank you so much for coming. I know it's cold and they've sprinkled in some rain as well. But it's wonderful to see the interest, and quite surprising actually, that there still is in Rider Haggard. But in fact, you do just have to read the introduction to Stephen Coan's magnificent biography, this book, The Buried Man, to realize how much interest there still is in Rider Haggard, particularly in scholarly circles. And I know that we are in for a wonderful discussion tonight. I'm really looking forward to this evening with Jane Carruthers and Stephen Coan as they chat about The Buried Man, which looks at Rider Haggard's years in South Africa. So welcome to both of you, and lovely to have you here at Love Books, and congratulations to you, Stephen, on this. This must have taken you a long time, I think. But congratulations on the publication. I'm going to introduce Jane Carruthers this evening, and then I'll hand over to Jane, and she's going to do the introductions for Stephen. It is difficult to know where to start when you're introducing Jane. Maybe I should start by making sure you can see her. And also how to keep it short. So I've tried to pull out the important bits, but there's a lot to say about Jane. She is Emeritus Professor of History at UNISA. She's widely published on a variety of topics, but is probably best known for her book, The Kruger National Park, A Social and Political History, which, if I'm right, was published back in 1995, Jane, and which has become a standard reference work. She's also the biographer of James Stevenson Hamilton, who was the first warden of the Kruger National Park. Her research areas include environmental justice and the history of national parks, the origins of wildlife management and game ranching, land restitution issues, landscape design and ecology, heritage, cartography, and transnational history. That's just some of it. She's currently editor-in-chief of the South African Journal of Science. She's a research associate of the Centre for Invasion Biology at Stellenbosch University, and she's a fellow of the Stellenbosch Institute of Advanced Studies. And as I've made clear, I've left a lot out. Jane, it's really lovely to have you here tonight, and thank you so much. And over to you. I'm just going to toil around the mic.
Thank you very much, Kate. Can you hear me? Is that better? No. Is that better? No, it's not on. I don't think it's not on. Is it on? Does that better? Okay, thank you, everyone. Kate, thank you very much for that fulsome introduction. Fortunately, I'm not still the editor of the South African Journal of Science, but it was a great adventure at the time. We are very much appreciative of your having us here this evening, so thank you for that. And good evening, everyone. We'd like to welcome you to the launch of this important new book, The Buried Man, A Life of Rider Haggard. And we do appreciate your coming out on a very, very cold Johannesburg evening. I'd also like to emphasize how grateful we are to Kate for hosting this discussion at Love Books. It's become quite a Johannesburg tradition, and a very, very super one at that. Also, thanks to Hearst, the publishers of this book, and Blue Weaver, the distributors, of which Owen is here this evening. Thank you very much for your support of this wonderful book. Stephen will be adding his own thanks to those involved. The format this evening we thought should be, and this is, I will introduce Stephen and outline his career, and then Stephen would like to take the opportunity first to thank everybody. And although Rider Haggard's name is still well known, perhaps his career has faded into the background. He hasn't been writing for a long time, and although his works are studied by academics very assiduously, as Kate mentioned, perhaps in the public domain, his emphasis and his work has receded. So Stephen will give a synopsis of Rider Haggard's life and mention some of the main elements in it before we begin to talk about the book. Just to remind us of all his many publications and his work as an author and imperial administrator. But most of the evening, of course, will be devoted to discussing this book and the very manifold aspects of Haggard's life and career. Stephen will also explain and be very grateful to answer your questions, sort of things like how does Kipling compare with Haggard, or vice versa, the many literary figures that Haggard encountered in his life, and how he fits into that circle. Maybe he does, even more so as time goes by. But certainly his South African life is what Stephen has been concentrating on, and I think that is where the exciting elements of this book lie. Well, Stephen was born in London. He's not a born South African, but he has been here for a long time. After school, he joined the BBC as a news editor or a news researcher for the news. And then he became a film editor for the BBC. But in 1975, he came to South Africa and worked as a film editor in Johannesburg for several years before deciding to go it on his own as a freelance writer and film director and theatre director. In the time he was in Johannesburg, he won several awards, including as director the Breitenbach Epatheon for his production of the play Stevie by Hugh Whitmore at the Market Theatre, and Dorothy Ann Gould, a very famous South African actress, was in the title role, and he won a prize for that. In 1990, he moved to Pietermaritzburg and joined the then Natal Witness, now the Witness, where he has held various offices. He was a feature writer and a sub-editor at night. That must have been exciting. The arts editor, assistant editor, and senior feature writer. And while his feature articles covered a wide range of subject matter, he became particularly renowned for his writing on literature, history, and film. And so he has made a special career in those. But he also contributes articles and continues to do so in the more scholarly journals, the Natal Society Journal, Natalia, and other publications. But I think it is worth noting that in 2010, Stephen was awarded the Prince Mangosuthu Buthelezi Prize for services to the Zulu people and for his fair and balanced reporting on Zulu history and culture over many years. In The Witness, while his articles on feature films made in KwaZulu-Natal during the 20th century saw him honoured at the KwaZulu-Natal Film Commission's inaugural Simon Mabunu Sabela Film Awards in 2013 for being a pioneer for his contribution to the film industry. But Stephen is also a poet, and his poetry has been published in various literary publications, including the English Academy Review, Sesame, Fidelities, and Carapace, and his collection, Chant of the Doves, was published in 2008. He retired from The Witness in 2014. But throughout this time and this very varied career that I have very quickly summarized, he's been at Haggard. He's been researching and writing and thinking about the life and times and work of Henry Rider Haggard, the author of King Solomon's Mines, Allan Quatermain, and She. But he's focused on the years that the young Haggard, very young Haggard, spent in southern Africa from 1875 to 1881, a momentous time in South African history. In pursuit of Haggard, he was involved in publishing for the first time Haggard's Diary of an African Journey, in which Haggard came back to South Africa in 1914, and his diary was never published before Stephen got hold of it. He also co-edited Mameena and Other Plays, the dramatic works of Rider Haggard. He was also a playwright, and this was published by UKZN Press. And he also was involved in preparing the Rider Haggard Trail, which inaugurated the innovative KZN Literary Tourism Trail series. So these early forays into the life and work of Haggard strengthened his long intention to write a full biography of Haggard, and that is what we are launching tonight. It is a magisterial work, and we are launching it tonight in the hope that there are some changed opinions of Haggard, lots of interesting facts uncovered about Haggard, and it is a very readable and enjoyable book. So over to you, Stephen, to make your thanks, and I will then ask you to tell us briefly about Haggard and to expand on the title, perhaps, that you chose for your book.
Can you hear me? It sounds like a seance.
It does.
And Haggard was present at many seances in his life, early life. First of all, as Jane was saying, I'd just like to echo her thanks and my thanks to Kate and Love Books for hosting this evening, to Hearst, particularly the publisher Michael Dwyer, who published the book, The Buried Man, and also to Blue Weaver, the distributors in this country, Owen is here tonight, and most of all to Jane for her introduction, and looking forward to the discussion we're going to have and the questions from you who've come tonight on this cold Johannesburg midwinter night, with snowy looking clouds on the way that we saw coming from the centre on the other side. So thank you all for coming. Some of you are involved with this book, some of you are in the acknowledgements, and I thank you for your participation in helping to create this book. As Jane said, I'll do a sort of Haggard 101, just for those who've perhaps forgotten the books they may have read in their childhood. Haggard was born in Norfolk in 1856. He's the eighth of 10 children in the family of William and Ella Haggard. William was the sort of local country squire. And thereafter, he had a fairly chaotic education. And the general opinion, certainly within the family, was that he was a bit of a dunderhead. His father said, "You're not fit to be a damned greengrocer." He went on to worry what was the problem with being a greengrocer. Anyway, in 1875, it's organised that we've got to do something with him. All the other brothers, the older brothers, have all sort of got careers in the army, the navy, and the diplomatic service. They all spread out to the British Empire. He gets a job via a family friend as an unpaid intern to the staff of Sir Henry Bulwer, who's a family friend, who's coming out to take up the post of Lieutenant Governor of the British colony of Natal. But just prior to this, and this is a thread that runs through his life, he falls deeply in love with a young woman, Lily Jackson, and he gets secretly engaged to her before he leaves for Natal. In Natal, he works as a sort of secretary, general dog's body for Bulwer, and he's unpaid. And he's obviously only planning to be in South Africa or Southern Africa, then Natal for a short while, a sort of a year at most, probably. While he's here in Pietermaritzburg in Natal, he writes his first article, A Zulu War Dance. But it's proceeded into publication a year later by one on the Transvaal, where Haggard has gone in the party led by Theophilus Shepstone, who's the Secretary of Native Affairs in Natal, but has now been tasked as Special Commissioner by Queen Victoria and the British government to go and annex the Transvaal. This is a sort of secret and annexation by stealth with a very small group. So they head up to Pretoria. Haggard helps raise the Union Jack a few months later in Pretoria, and he becomes eventually Registrar of the High Court. In Pretoria, he makes a lifelong friend with Arthur Cochrane, also a civil servant, and they build a cottage together, ironically calling it the Palatial. There he learns that Lily Jackson has married another man, and he's devastated. He goes on a bender. He has an affair with the wife of a colleague and results in the birth of a child. Something that only came to light, not in my book, but in an earlier book by Victoria Manthorpe. And then the diary that Jane mentioned helped put another few pieces together. By this time, anyway, there's been a change in the administration. Shepstone's been kicked out, and Haggard and Cochrane they decide to leave the civil service, and they buy a farm outside Newcastle in Natal, where they intend farming mainly with ostriches. Haggard returns to England for a 3-month visit on sort of leave, and there he learns his child has died. Her name was Ethel Ryder. She lived a few months. And shortly after that, he becomes engaged to and then marries Louisa Margenson, who's an orphaned heiress. They return to Natal just in time for the Transvaal Rebellion, or sometimes called the First Anglo-Boer War. The Boers win. the Transvaal reverts to being a republic again. And by this stage, he and Louis, his wife, that's how she's known, they've also had a child now, their first child, a son called Jock, decide this is not a safe place to live in, so they leave and they go back to Britain. There he practices his law, and in his spare time he writes. And he publishes 2 books, 2 3-volume novels, which was the standard format at that time in the 1870s. Sorry, the 1880s. We're in the early 1880s by now. And he gets good reviews, but he doesn't make any money. And he's just about to pack it in. I should have preceded that. His first book, actually, is not a novel. It's a work of non-fiction called Quechua and His White Neighbours, a polemic, basically, but a very well-written one, supporting Shepstone and his views on both the Transvaal and the Zulus. So he writes these 2 melodramatic novels, and then suddenly comes King Solomon's Mines, a single volume and much better. And it becomes an instant bestseller, and he's suddenly, in a way, the first of his kind, although we can probably talk a bit about how that came to be. And he becomes a household name. And it's, I think, one of those great names like, Rider Haggard and Rudyard Kipling, even if they're not read that much now, certainly the names are well remembered. Other books follow, notably She, Alan Quatermain, a sequel to King Solomon's Mines, and Nada the Lily, which is an interesting book, particularly from a South African point of view, because it's what you could call an all-Zulu novel, set at the time of Shaka. He goes on the way to going to Egypt. After all these books have come out, he's famous. He sets off to Egypt where he's never been before, but is fascinated by it. But he leaves behind him a sort of a ticking time bomb in the shape of an article called About Fiction, where he very unwisely, as a sort of chap who's under 30, expresses all his views on writers of the day. Mistake. And one that he lives to regret. Then at the end of in 1890-91, he's in Mexico with his wife. They've gone on a trip with another sort of an adventurer they're determined to find the gold lost by the conquistadors. And it's almost like a King Solomon's Mines adventure come to life. But while they're there in Mexico City, their son Jock dies at the age of 9. And this is a huge tragedy. They sort of, there's not time in those days traveling by boat to get back to the funeral, so they sort of wander around in Mexico for a while and then they return. And Haggard never really recovers from this, and he was already a depressive before then. In his school days he talks about it, and then that was the onset of chronic depression, and also exhibited itself in a sort of chronic bronchitis, particularly in cold English winters. He carries on writing for the rest of his life, and by the end of which he'd written 70 books, and that included 10 non-fiction works, 12 contemporary novels, and the rest are either adventures or historical novels, or what at the time was described as romances. He worked for a while in the city on the African Review, which was part of Cecil Rhodes' propaganda arm, basically a mining journal, but it contained a lot of arts and culture information as well. He hated being in the city, so after about 9 months he resigned. And then after that he more or less takes refuge in his Norfolk estate at Ditchingham, which he gained by marrying Louis earlier, as I mentioned. He's asked to stand for Parliament for the Conservative Party for East Norfolk. He loses, but with quite a narrow margin, and decides he never was a party man. So he remains a sort of, I wouldn't say a reactionary figure, but he doesn't quite neatly fit into even the British sort of society and establishment. He starts to concentrate on farming, And he ends up being an agricultural reformer of the period. He wrote for two notable books, A Farmer's Year, which, as it sounds, is a diary of a year on his farm in Norfolk, and then a two-volume, huge book of 600 pages each, Rural England, where he visits all the English counties and reports on the social and agricultural conditions. He served for several years on a government commission on coastal erosion, which also involved going to Ireland. In 1912, he's knighted for his public service, not literature, and he's appointed as Britain's representative on the Dominion's Royal Commission, which is tasked with investigating how the white settler societies, the Dominions, can come to the aid of a struggling mother country which is beginning to trail behind both Germany and the United States, both economically, militarily as well. He visits Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa, where, among other things, he seeks out and interviews John Dubé, the first president of the ANC, the African National Congress. The DRC's visit to Canada is cut short by World War I. In 1916, Haggard becomes a one-man commission who's tasked by the British government to go around the Dominions again in wartime to try and establish some form of settlement for servicemen who will come out of the war when it finally ends. One paper describes him, a newspaper describes him as a second St. Paul, preaching empire settlement. Post-war, he serves on various government committees, but his batteries by then are clearly running low. His daughter quotes somebody as saying, "The Haggard males always die young." He's yesterday's man, adrift in a radically different world from the one he grew up in. But he continues writing to the end, which comes in 1925, which is exactly 100 years ago. Okay.
Stephen, thank you for that. I think we all needed the reminder. I mean, this is an absolutely remarkable human being. I think you've got to agree to pack all of that into one life, and the difference between the sort of the imagination of his novels and the real work that he did on agriculture for the empire, you know, is a very unusual set of talents, if you like. But there have been other biographies of Rider Haggard. He wrote his autobiography. His youngest daughter, named Lilias, because that references his first love, he never got over her. So you've chosen the title The Buried Man, and we know a lot about Rider Haggard. What did you want to exhume?
That's the sort of the question that sort of started off the whole book in a way. The biographies, his autobiography he actually wrote in 1912. It ends with him getting his knighthood, and he hastily finishes it, and it's locked away in a safe at, I think, Longman's, and with the instruction that it be published after his death, which it is in 1926. And I don't think, by then he's faded out as a writer, or his reputation, I think, and I think it only went into one edition, so it wasn't republished and not many people read it. Nothing happens biographically until 1950, where Lilias writes this book, The Cloak That I Left, which, despite her being his youngest daughter and family, is a very good biography, and actually very frank, particularly about his depression and other aspects of his life, which I can see and a later reader will see she's drawn a veil over, but obviously knew what happened, particularly what happened in Pretoria. And then there's Morton Cohn, an American academic and biographer, brought out the first sort of proper critical literary biography, and still is the sort of benchmark. It's called Rider Haggard, The Storytellers. And after that, there's sort of nothing much. Then it was about 3 biographies came out, and all, as very often happens with biographies, had to have something that was new. And the big new thing was, who was Lily Jackson? Because nobody even knew her name. Her name was disguised by Lilias, who called her Lilith. And but nobody knew until Victoria Manthorpe, D.S. Higgins wrote a biography called Rider Haggard, the Great Storyteller, and his big coup was actually, and this was before the days of the internet, actually working out who she was. And her name was Lily Elizabeth, but known as Lily Jackson, and her brother was better known to history as Frederick Jackson, who was a Governor General of East Africa. And they'd met at a ball in Richmond, got this secretly engaged, and then she subsequently married another man called Francis Archer, and I think I'll pick up the story later on that. And then Victoria Manthorpe did a brilliant book called Children of Empire on Haggard, all the siblings, because there were these 10 children, 8 of which went off and worked in the empire. And she looked at all of them, and she managed to reveal more information about what had happened in Pretoria, and started providing names that she'd found from correspondence that had recently come into the Haggard family, obviously bought from another family, and identified the person that he had an affair with was named Ford, Mrs. Ford, who was the wife of Lewis Ford, who was a legal figure in Pretoria. And we'll go into that a bit later as well, probably. So that was the big reveal there. But I felt all these biographies, and there's a couple of others, none of them really covered the South African material, what happened, the actual historical events that Haggard had lived through, which saw the Anglo-Zulu War, the First Anglo-Boer War, Transvaal Rebellion, and the final subjugation of the Pedi and other indigenous peoples. And most of the biographers, in fact, all of them, apart from Norman Etherington, who has a strong background, as some of you will know, in South African historical studies, and he didn't do a biography. He did a literary study where he looked at the novels and so on. And he sort of, in a brief introduction, gets the South African history correct. Other biographers tended to be, as you would say now, from the global north, and they would rely heavily on Haggard's accounts. And Haggard's accounts are accurate at one point, but they're actually totally biased because of his loyalty to Theophilus Shepstone. So his first book, Quechua and His White Neighbours, which outlines the way Shepstone saw things, which was basically anti-Boer and anti-Zulu, sort of gains prominence. And that I felt needed to be corrected. And you would find in the bibliographies there was no mention of some of the revisionist historians, particularly of the 70s and 80s, and in South Africa, just hadn't been looked at. And so I felt that was a gap. And then the clincher, I'd started researching on Haggard for quite some time, as Jane mentions, but it was just sort of out of interest. And the interest was finally, I began to realize there was something here. There's information I'm finding out that hasn't been sort of seen elsewhere. But the clincher came when I had ordered some material on microfilm. This shows how long ago that was. In 1997 from the Norfolk Records Office, where they had this cryptic thing. It said on their catalogue, Diary of Journey in South Africa, rough diary, and in 1914. And so I ordered it, and it duly came in the post, which also shows how long ago this was. When I looked at it at the University of what was then Natal, I was paging through it, and it was a rough note diary. It was basically an aide memoir, but it had some detail, and what he'd done each day on this visit to South Africa when he came here for the Dominion's Royal Commission, and took time out to go to old haunts as well, the places he lived in. And the eureka moment was when I came across this interview with John Dubé, John Langalibalele Dubé, the founding president of the ANC, and putting that name to Haggard, who one regards normally as a sort of certainly as a conservative figure, to say the least, and a sort of imperial colonialist. I just was astonished, not only by the fact that the name was mentioned, but he'd actually written down in detail this review, read it back to John Dubé, who agreed that what he said was accurate, and sort of signed off on that. So I thought, this is the kernel of a book, because it sees Haggard also representing his views back to the Colonial Office in London and saying, Dubé's right, the Land Act is dreadful. And this suddenly puts a whole new light on Haggard. Then I think that the question you really asked was about the title, The Buried Man. And Graham Greene, who was a Haggard fan, who read them all as a child, and writes about them as well in some essays. And one of his essays, called Rider Haggard's Secret, which is basically a review come essay of Lewis's book. He talks about how shocked he was to read in an account of a conversation between Haggard and Kipling, where Haggard refers to this world as one of the hells. And he said this, leaped startlingly from the page, because one remembered the adventures, but didn't remember the sort of melancholy that actually is in them. And those were the sort of boring bits we skipped over. And then he says that Haggard was the public man, but he kept his life private. And fairly, even with Lewis's book, you don't get into a sense of him as a writer, particularly, and his thinking. And he says, you'll find the buried man in his books, and that's where he sort of comes to life. So I thought, The Buried Man, that's clearly the title. And it also gave me a sort of a lodestone to hang on to. Whenever and working as a journalist, the question you always ask yourself when you don't know where this thing's going is, what is it about? So I'd reread Graham Greene's essay and he'd let me know. So, yeah.
Well, thank you for that, because the thing that you also have uncovered, I think, as well as much more detail about Rider Haggard, is the South African context, the historical context in which this imaginative man is working, and which he mines, but not directly, into some of his books. And Stephen's been very clever at linking Haggard's personal interaction with some of the characters in his book and how he changes them imaginatively into literary figures, I suppose. But the context of South Africa, into which Haggard dipped over the annexation of the Transvaal in 1877, and being with all the high-ups of Bulwer and Shepstone and so on, then he comes back in 1914 for his second African journey, or the diary that Stephen has just mentioned, which is another momentous time in South Africa. So there's a lot of South African history going on during Haggard's life, and I would have thought it was a very daunting thing, Stephen, to put that context in and always include Haggard in it. I mean, that's a trial for any biographer, is where you put the context and the person so that the one doesn't swamp the other, and then, a couple of pages later you've got to say, oh, and by the way, the Transvaal was being annexed. Did you find that a difficult thing to do?
Yes. I think that was one of the major challenges of the book. Also keeping the reader in mind, which... This is a book published by an English publisher, but it's distributed in South Africa. So you had to bear in mind, the question I was, how much do people need to know to put Haggard into this sort of historical context? And I think that the books themselves, especially the early ones, provided a useful thing to hang on to while you embroidered the history into it. And for example, something like when he comes to South Africa, to Natal, there are paragraphs which describe sort of Natal history as briefly, but as to give you the information you need to know to relate to the biography. And then the problem was the sort of gap in time, because he leaves South Africa in 1881, he comes back in 1914. South Africa's gone from being a sort of basically agricultural-based economy, but certainly minerals are already being exploited, and everybody knows, but then, that sooner or later we're going to find some gold somewhere, which happens in 1886 in Johannesburg, and then you've got these other historical events going on. The South African War, the Anglo-Boer War. Haggard keeps in touch with sort of South African affairs, so I could always sort of link him in. And this book of his, Quechua and His White Neighbors, was very conveniently published just when the Anglo-Boer War broke out. They cut bits and retitled it with a new introduction, The Last Boer War, looking at 1881. So he was always keeping up this sort of contact. But when he comes back in 1914, he's facing a country which is totally industrialized, has railways everywhere. I mean, when he left in 1881, there was a railway from Pietermaritzburg to Durban, and that was it. And there were some railways, obviously, in the Cape. So suddenly he's traveling everywhere by rail, and even up to Bulawayo and Salisbury, as it was called then. So it's a completely changed sort of landscape. And the other thing to mention, and this is more in Jane's field, is the change in the wildlife. Even in the 1870s, Haggard is in areas where the wildlife, certainly around Maritzburg, has been completely shot out. And he, even while in deeper into sort of rural Natal, into the Thorns in the Msinga area, he talks about there having been elephant and various other animals there, and he's looking out on this, what he calls this silence. And he reiterates this when he even goes up to Pretoria. He goes on sort of hunting trips, and he also goes on a long trip to see the Bapedi chief, Sesekukuni. And they go through areas, there's the Olifants River, but there's no elephants. And you realize that how early the disappearance of South African wildlife was happening.
Yeah, they're a totally different political and physical landscape.
Yeah.
You know?
So that was interesting.
Yeah. What did he draw on, I mean, for his imagination in his novels? I mean, are they worth reading now? I mean, there are 58 of them, and you've very cleverly wound up some of the stories, because I have only read, and a long time ago, the big adventure stories. But the other writings of Haggard, Stephen has very cleverly given you the basis of the plot as you go through this biography, and it really is fantastic to do it like that. But the sort of figures in his life whom he met and he translated into his stories, do they have any meaning now? I mean, are they still read?
Yes, I think if you look at the novels, the adventure novels, the romances, she and King Solomon's Mines remain in print and still in sort of popular editions, but they've more migrated into the annotated Penguin Classics or Oxford Classics. Mm-hmm. King Solomon's Mines, I still think, reads very well as an adventure story, but looking at it through a modern lens as you read along, it deconstructs itself as a colonial novel. So I found it, and I've read it again recently, it's still a fascinating book, but for different reasons. And then I think still remains it's just an extraordinary book. It's one of those sort of standalones, rather like Bram Stoker's Dracula. Where did all this come from? And Haggard talks about writing it in 6 weeks at white heat, and which is an indicator as why Carl Jung and I was about to say Sigmund Freud. They lit on this very quickly as being. I mean, Freud talks about it being full of strange meaning, and Jung sees it as Aisha, she who must be obeyed, as a prime example of the anima, the female archetype. And particularly because Haggard writes it at white heat, so one gets the impression his intellect didn't come into play. And I still think she reads as a remarkable book. Henry James hated it because it was full of gore and it was dreadful. And he writes to Robert Louis Stevenson about it. Stevenson's on Samoa by then. And I don't know whether Stevenson agreed or not, because Stevenson was also in communication with Rider Haggard and had liked King Solomon's Mines and written to him to say so. But also said you must brush up your style a bit. But he also declared later on, one of the most interesting books that I mentioned was from his All Zulu novel, Nada the Lily, and set at the time of Shaka. And Robert Louis Stevenson just sent Nada the Lily, A1. So they were definitely sort of batting on the same side. Henry James continued to dislike Haggard intensely, or the writing anyway, and I don't think particularly probably liked him as a person if they met, but they did go to the same club, the Savile Club, at one stage. And later in life, Haggard records Henry James dying, whenever that was, in the early 1920s, and says something along the lines, he was a nice old chap. I wonder if anybody will read his books 100 years from now.
That's quite a comment, isn't it? But if they are read now, and I mean, Victorian novels like this gave one a flavour of the rest of the world, and it would, I presume, be said that Haggard's Africa was imperial Africa. But are they racist in tone? I mean, he was clearly changing his mind throughout his life, which is not everybody does that.
Yes. I would say that the novels, or certainly like King Solomon's Mines, it's racist to a point, at the point where we wouldn't find it, you wouldn't approve of it today. But in the context of sort of the colonial period, particularly the British Empire, Haggard, I think, like Rudyard Kipling, and even like Bishop John Colenso, they didn't see anything inherently wrong with the imperial mission. They saw the imperial mission as a civilizing and Christianizing mission. And so you have to see them within that sort of paternalist framework and not necessarily divorce them into or impose our ways of thinking on them, but actually see where they're coming from. Haggard gets to the point where, I mean, Shepstone, as you probably know, was a great friend of Bishop Colenso, and they had a big falling out over the Langala Bailey rebellion and the sort of show trial that Shepstone manipulated. And Colenso said, that, and they used to dine every Sunday luncheon and so on. And then it became what Colenso described as a war to the knife. And Haggard came under sort of in the Shepstone camp because that was who he was working for. And Shepstone also became a surrogate sort of father figure to him as well. And but by 1914, he's clearly changed his views and realizes that things have to change here. I'll just read something that he said.
Yes, do.
Yeah. This is when he goes to see John Dubé. Right. So he's requested to see John Dubé because he's, as well as doing the work for the Dominions Royal Commission, which is basically people turning up at the town halls where the DRC is sitting and presenting evidence on various subjects, economics, agriculture, trade, whatever. He's also asking questions about the racial situation. And the racial question at that point was not so much racial in terms of black-white, it was racial in terms of Boer Britain. And so you find he talks with Louis Botha, and it's always they talk about with the post-Boer War and the Union, what's the relationship between Boer and Britain, and gets various sort of views on that. the so-called sort of native question is sort of shunted to the side, but everybody's more or less saying, we've got to deal with this. And when he goes to see John Dubé, who's just about to go, set off to the Cape and then to London with a whole group to protest the 1913 Land Act. And John Dubé tells Haggard, you must, and this is Dubé's words, you must remember that we natives today only hold as native reserves 10 million Morgan, 20 million acres, out of the 400 million Morgan, 800 million acres in the Union. And Dubé, obviously objected to that and just pointed out that it was a just totally unequal affair when the populations were, the reverse. And Dubé told Haggard that in recent times, white people have been tightening the screw more and more. They used to be more sympathetic. This attitude has evoked a like feeling among the natives whose sentiments towards the whites are now harsher than they used to be. They say if the whites declare they cannot live with us, let them go away and live in their own country. And he tells Haggard that your people could do more to bring about a better standing if they chose. They have the power in their hands and can take us natives into their confidence. And he continues that, and he points out the sort of magistrate system that operated, which was the point of contact between indigenous people and the authorities, didn't really work. And Haggard then writes, and he says, Haggard, and this is writing to Louis Harcourt, the colonial secretary in London, he talks about, Haggard says, Dubé impressed me most favourably. And I think it's in the letter, and it's in which was separate from the diary, but it's in the diary, he repeats it. And he thought the case that Dubé advanced was a hard one to answer. And he says, thus, there is no doubt that this new Land Act inflicts great hardships on the native community. And if an attempt were made to enforce it everywhere, I do not know what would happen. But he also said, and was quite right, that Dubé had little hope of success, either with the Union Parliament or the King, and that he was just sort of not heard. But Haggard goes on to say, but what will be the end of it all? 7 million of black folk, I think that is about the number, including the populations of the protectorates, cannot be permanently neglected, or is oppressed the word, by 1.25 million of whites. Compressed steam will escape somehow and somewhere. And he goes on to foresee a time when there will not be a sort of a white ruling majority or minority in this country. And so in that way, he's not the sort of colonial figure who tends to be, by and large, sort of dismissed. And I think Haggard falls into a sort of stereotype now in the popular mind as being just a colonial novelist and not worth looking at. And in fact, he's so enmeshed in his period, I think he's very useful to look at, because I think what I write about is the fact that he's in this sort of network of imperial sort of civil servants, administrators. And as he ages, and they age, he keeps in contact with them. And you'll find two people who are very involved with the Land Act in various ways were William Beaumont, who did a separate commission, and Godfrey Lagden. He knew them both in Pretoria in the 1870s. He meets up with them again and again, and by the time he comes back in 1914, Lagden is back in Britain, I think, and a member of the Royal Colonial Institute, and William Beaumont is finishing off a commission on how we divide up land between indigenous Africans and white people. So we get a map, in a way, of Africa from South Africa from the 1870s up until the early 20th century, which I think is quite valuable.
It's a remarkable book, and it's remarkably detailed. And as I said, it's very readable. But the point is, I think that we need to complicate people more, not oversimplify them. And in our lives and in our world, I think the sort of smart answer, the quick answer, the social media kind of answer doesn't give one the fullness of any person's life. And Rider Haggard's life was an extremely interesting, complicated, a difficult man perhaps to understand. But I think that what Stephen has done is a remarkable piece of work, and I hope that those of you who read it, and I hope many will find it so. But you may have questions as an audience. May anybody? Right. What?
Yeah, so marrying an heiress is obviously a good thing to do, but does it make money as an author? Do you do well out of that?
Yes. No, he made a lot of money, and enough so that he could basically, although he farmed very seriously, he could do it without too much financial cost to himself. And the heiress thing is quite interesting, because then I've no doubt that he married for love, but he managed to love in the right place. And the money, there's a lovely letter he wrote to his wife, I think when he's in Egypt, after he's written all these bestsellers, and they're comfortably off. And he actually says to her how grateful he is to her, and that I can now give back to you, in a sense, the estate that I got from you. And that he'd always, this had preyed on his mind. And it's a very tender letter he's writing from Egypt. And to mention there also about his complicated personal life, his first love, who's married someone else and is out of the picture at the moment, but he has this affair with a married woman in Henrietta Ford in Pretoria, and they have his child. She has his child that dies. The big question is when he's in England, which is, I think, he meets Louis at Bradenham Hall, where he grows up. His sister went to school with her, and she invites her over and with a group of friends. That's how they meet. And they get engaged within a week. She can't even spell his name properly. She spells it R-Y-D-E-R, not right, with an I. And the quick question is, well, what did he tell her? Did he tell her about what happened in Pretoria? And he clearly did. And I was able to get final proof of that, because when he's in Egypt and he goes to Cyprus to stay there as well, she writes to him about, there's a furore growing up, happened in England, caused by this About Fiction article. But instead of attacking him, or the article, they attack him, and he gets he's accused of plagiarism. And W.T. Stead, the crusading journalist and who's credited with inventing the tabloid or the yellow press, he sort of pushed this agenda, and it went on for weeks. And they'd bring up, it was mainly she that they were concerned about. And I think he may have, at the very least, borrowed, but the accusations were, I think, completely over the top and didn't really stand scrutiny. He was accused of taking some things out of a book by George Moore and something else. Anyway, it got to the point where it was becoming, he had to address it, and he's in Cyprus at this point. He writes to Louis, and at this point there's this fuss about a poem that was in another book called Jess, that is not attributed to an author, so you presume it's Haggard. And he sort of says that it was sent to him by a lady he knew in Pretoria, and he thought she'd written it. And it looks as though the Pretoria, and it's clearly, one could see this is Henrietta Ford. And he writes to Louis, and he says, he gives details of how to go into this cupboard, take this key, open that safe, and you will find the letters sent from Pretoria by Mrs. F. And that will prove that like she sent the
Yeah.
poem. And
Well, it's
yeah.
nice then that that they became so close, despite the rather sort of poor start, being in love with somebody else to start with, and then sowing your wild oats in Pretoria. So, there's some sort of happiness in his life, I think, in his personal life, apart from the death of his son, which is. Stephen said, sort of really sort of tore the whole family, devastated them for the rest of their lives. Other questions, though? Yes.
Interested to find out, how did you get all the research? Surely that's private stuff. There's not a box where everything is in.
yeah.
You just open the box.
Yeah. Well, thanks. Yeah. Yeah. It's having got hold of this rough note diary that I saw in Maritzburg. I then contacted the Haggard family because Jock was the only son he had, and so the Haggard line, because of the name thing, had gone through one of the daughters, and their surname was Cheyne, Cheyne, and they still live on the Ditchingham estate. And they're mentioned by the other biographers, so I knew who they were. So I wrote to them and said I was looking at writing a biography, and I think I'd already written a brief thing for Natalia, which had some of the Natal stuff that was new, and I'd like to come and see them. Anyway, they invited me, and so in November in 1997, I saw them met them for the first time, and we basically chatted by the fire and got to know each other, and I said, look. I knew they had a sort of repository of material because it's referred to as the Chain collection, and that collection and the collection of the Norfolk Records Office in Norwich are the largest amounts of sort of Haggard material. And already they knew about the Mrs. Ford episode, but I said they both of them were Haggard's grandchildren. Which they'd been allowed to marry because she was adopted by one of the other daughters. So although they were sort of cousins in theory, there wasn't was a consanguinity. And I sort of broached the subject of what I was working on, and said, but I realise I'm treading on personal history here into your family, because I knew that was going to be, in a sense, the nut I had to crack. And Mark Cheyne said, that's fine, I have no problem, you just write the truth, as long as you can back it up, do what you like. And he became incredibly helpful, photocopying letters, and that gave me an entree to the collection, which is fairly haphazard. And it was rather like opening boxes, like, what will I find here? And I was saying to Jane the other day, it got to the stage when Nada, his wife, I'd be there and somebody would ask a question about family history, and she says, "Oh, I don't know, ask Stephen." So I was very, very fortunate, and I'm so sad that they're not alive to see the book. But each year I sort of went, and I had family in England, so I'd sort of usually match a sort of holiday to visit parents or brothers and sisters and so on, with a visit to Norwich and Ditchingham, and they'd find another box. And they literally found, Diary of an African Journey, I didn't know it existed. There was a typescript they had, and it was on the same visit, the first visit in 97, that Mark Cheyne said, "Oh, this guy, find a publisher." And there was this type manuscript, which I then, University of Natal, I mean, it was a perfect fit for them, because Haggard also, when he went round Zululand in 1914, went with James Stewart, the famous founder or creator of the James Stewart archives. Yeah, so that was that one, and then Mameena and Other Plays. And Mameena was a dramatisation of a novel of his about the Zulu Civil War in 1856 to decide the succession to the throne. But I knew he'd written an Irish play, of all things, and it was just referred to in the biographies and even by letters as an Irish play. So when the late Alfred Tella, who was a Haggard collector and printed little editions of pamphlets and things, he approached me and said, you know, we've got the script of Mameena, that was around. Shall we print it and you do the notes and things? And I never met him, this was all by email, and he lived in the States. And I said, well, there's only 2 others, so let's try and find them. So Morning Star, which was or Star of Egypt, which was an adaptation of Morning Star, one of his Egyptian novels, that was accessible. But there was this Irish play, and we could find correspondence with Yeats, because Haggard obviously proposed to Yeats putting it on at the Abbey Theatre in Ireland, in Dublin. Lady Gregory had said, for heaven's sake, because Haggard had sent him to read, don't read it because you'll hate it and then you'll have to tell him and then you'll make an enemy. And I don't think it could have been performed anyway at the Abbey because it wasn't written by a native Irish person. But anyway, where's this play? And one day I got a phone call from Nada, we found the Irish play.
Fantastic.
Yeah. And it was called To Hell or Connaught, which was Cromwell's sort of curse on the Irish, you know, that you either move out, go to the east, was it West Coast, or you go to hell. So you go to Connaught. And Haggard based this play on sort of an incident in the Cromwellian period. And I think he thought, and certainly his ideas would have been in conformity with the general thinking of the Tory party on Irish independence. But he managed to write a play which had a villain that both Yeats and he could dislike. And so it's sort of, it's viable, I could see, but anyway, I don't think Yeats read it. But then they got on quite well because they were both interested in the supernatural, the occult. And that was one of Haggard's interests, and both Haggard's connection to Yeats was because both he and Yeats had both had their sort of religious imaginations stimulated by reading a book called Esoteric Buddhism by Alfred Sonnet, who was a disciple of Madame Blavatsky of Theosophy. And this had actually completely altered their way of thinking. So there was a connection between them.
Well, lovely to have had the family support, I think, because that doesn't always happen. And if they're phoning you up saying, wow, look what I've found, that's even nicer. Other questions before we, I think, need to call it?
Could you, how much of a physical footprint is there left of Rider Haggard in South Africa? Could you do a Rider Haggard tour?
Yeah.
Going to the farmhouse?
Yes and no. Let me think. The KZN is quite good because it's got Newcastle Hilldrop, the farmhouse outside Newcastle, which is now a sort of like Airbnb bed and breakfast type thing, and it's exactly as it was, apart from some buildings rooms they've built. It's called Haggard's at Hilldrop. That was the name of the farmhouse. The other place, there's of course the battlefield of Isandlwana, which Haggard visited in 1914, but visited it particularly because a lot of his friends, people he knew, were killed at the battle in 1879. I'm trying to think of the other place associated with him in KZN is Ghost Mountain, Tashaneni, up near in the Lubombo range. And that's where he sets most of Nada the Lily. And people there will tell you that Haggard wrote this here and so on. He didn't, and he'd never been to the place, but had read about it through other accounts by people like Henry Callaway and what's his name, David Leslie, I think. And but that's there, and it is the setting of a novel. In the Transvaal, you've got where his cottage was. That was demolished. I think it's now Toyota have got a factory on it. But there is a Rider Haggard Street, so in a very forlorn part of Pretoria, just by the prison. And it's quite interesting that when he came here in 1914, he was taken to see the cottage, which still was there. And he said, it's quite a good thoroughfare it's in. I'm sure one day it will be a famous road or something. Anyway, it's not. But all these things go down other rabbit holes. In 1947, I think it was, or it might have been in the 60s, there was a plan to demolish Hilldrop before Toyota got there. And there were objections to it. And a writer, some of you will know, I can't remember his first name, but his surname was Rex. He was Afrikaans. And he was part of a committee set up by the sort of Heritage Society in Pretoria to prevent this happening. And apart from knowing Haggard from King Solomon's Mines and a few other things, he didn't really know much about Haggard. But then he started reading his books and found that there was this incredible anti-Boer Afrikaans prejudice in them, which there is, which is a whole other story. But anyway, he got to the point where he decided this guy was so anti-Boer, he could have nothing to do with this, and resigned from the committee, and then wrote a pamphlet about it, which I managed to get hold of a copy somehow, and a friend of mine who's Afrikaans translated it for me. And he based a lot of his thinking on Gustav Preller, who at the time of Haggard's visit had signed himself in a letter, Dutch Afrikaner, to the Pretoria News, objecting to Haggard and his anti-Boer prejudice. And Haggard at the time had by then that become quite sort of friendly about the Boers, and was saying so in his speeches and so on at the time. And Gustav Preller says, he's saying all this in his speeches. Meanwhile, the Star is serializing Marie, which is his first book before Child of Storm, set against the Great Trek and Battle of Blood River, where the Boers are not good guys. And there's this dreadful racist nonsense being published in the Star, and that became a minor sort of, but fizzled out fairly quickly when he was here in 1914.
Well,
So,
all these connections, and I think just to go back to Kate's question earlier, I mean, in chatting to Stephen about this book and Rider Haggard, and Vincent and I were in Wackerstroom not long ago. Oh, Rider Haggard lived here for a while. So I think Stephen's next book is the places that Rider Haggard did not go to.
I'll probably end on that note.
Yes, there's a question over there.
Yeah. Well, let's answer the question. Answer the question, and I'll tell the other bit. Yeah. No, Mavenda. Yeah.
We've never talked about this before, you and I. But now that we touched on the relationship between Bishop Colenso and Haggard,
Yeah.
as well as Shepstone, whom you know I hate with them,
Yeah.
I would like your opinion on Bishop Colenso,
Mm.
because my father really held him in high esteem.
Yeah.
And the arguments in the 50s and 60s when we were growing, we didn't understand why our dad should bother about a liberal or a conservative
Yeah.
person. And yet, he played such an important role with Zulu people.
Mm.
So I'd like to know if you could just
Yeah.
explain to me what you think of Bishop Colenso.
Yeah. He was a remarkable man. And I think what is particularly interesting about him is how his theology was changed by his contact with the Zulu people. And I think he's Jeff Guy, who said you have to have some affection for your subject if you're going to write a biography, did a wonderful biography of Colenso called The Heretic. And I think that he remains one of the remarkable people of that time. And I think, as Jeff Guy says, that I think in his book on Theophilus Shepstone and the colony of Natal, that by the time, say, when Haggard came back in 1914, Colenso was no longer, and Colenso was long dead, he died in 1883, Colenso had sort of morphed into being one of the sort of figures of the past, wearing old-fashioned clothes and boots and so on. So his reputation had been softened. What I've found in answering your question, another interesting thing I think was when there was a centenary or something involving Colenso, and there was a book brought out by Cluster Publications on some of his other writings, and I did an interview with whoever was the Anglican bishop at the time in Maritzburg. And it was quite evident that within the Anglican Church, there were still concerns about Colenso, not so much about his theology, which, as Haggard said, I think in 94, had become orthodoxy, but about the whole issue of obedience to your bishop, because he transgressed that. You know, he disobeyed his bishop, and that's why the Anglican Church got rid of him as much as his theology. And it was, I think, particularly at Bishopstow, it was like he was the communication point between Ketchwayo and the authorities. So he acted as an incredible sort of middle person between the Zulus, and was also one of those voices who was sort of the authorities didn't want to hear. And so I think he stands out as a remarkable figure, as somebody who unpicks the colonial system and how it doesn't work, and is racist in implementation. But at the same time, he also writes about, rather as Haggard and Kipling, they see the empire as being a good thing, but it's being imperfectly implemented. And they never quite cross the barrier of saying how, even Colenso, how do we become equal? Because there's still this sort of, what's the sort of grey area? What's that liminal space that gets used a lot? Where do we meet together? So there are black Christians and educated, like John Dubé, the Amakolwa, but they never seem to fit into any government arrangement, and they're always pushed aside. And there's this racist settler prejudice, which is expressed, and Haggard talks about it, about, you know, a Christianized African has been spoiled, and those are not my words, but others. And so I'm not dissing Colenso, but I do think he has to be seen also, as Jane says, as a complicated person at a complicated time. But he's an admirable person, no doubt.
Yeah. Thank you for that question. And let's have a last one here, because I think we are...
So thank you very much. You've positioned the book which we've talked about today very much as Haggard in South Africa. To what extent, as the 20th century started and unfolded until 1925, was he seen in England as a South African author, or having been influenced by his experience in South Africa, or was he seen as English?
Yeah. I think he was sort of an Englishman abroad, and has sort of had his finger on sort of African affairs, which as time went on he didn't really. So he's seen, I mean, King Solomon's Mines filled a gap. Here was an adventure story set in Africa. We've only read about this in sort of traveller's tales and so on. And suddenly there's this whole new thing that's sort of thrown up. And perhaps one point to make is that most of his books, although they start off in South Africa, they always go off into this sort of African interior that sort of becomes Haggard's the Africa of his imagination. And I think by the time of his death in 1925, and I cover all this in the book, it's not exclusively South Africa, he's gained a reputation, certainly at certain levels, as being a sort of bit of a rebel. And I mean, at one point in the 1900s, the government get him and William Booth, who was the head of the Salvation Army, to go. He commissioned Haggard to go to America to look at the Salvation Army labor colonies there, which was basically places where urban poor were educated in sort of agricultural skills, and then given to go back to the land or other forms of employment. And he was given this job to, perhaps this is a model we could use in England for our urban poor. And also there's this whole exit from the land to the cities. And so off he goes, and William Booth doesn't go with him, but he's very much part of all this. And it's only when he gets back, and this report is basically buried, he realizes, and so does William Booth, that they've been seen as major opponents in an election year, have been quietly sent off, misdirected, So he gains a reputation as a sort of critic of empire, if you like, and of the British government. But come the First World War, after the first, things change anyway. So he becomes a sort of a voice gradually fading out.
Yeah. All interesting aspects. If there's another burning question, but otherwise I'm just going. Yes, Kathy.
Was he a happy man?
That's a very good question. I don't know. His nephew, in the introduction to Lillis's book, The Cloak That I Left, talks about having a sense that his uncle always had some sense of having done something awful, and just this sense of he was being punished, or would be punished. And it seems to go back to what happened in Pretoria. And this was a sort of thing he was always trying to work out. And one of the threads in the book is that Lily comes back into his life in strange ways, but not in terms of relationship. And a lot of his fiction, particularly the contemporary novels, and even she, is trying to work out this triangular relationship between Lily, his great love, who he sort of, in the books will sort of, you get the impression, will meet again in the hereafter, Louis and him. And he's always rearranging these 3 points of the triangle. And you do get the impression that I don't think I would call him a happy man.
You said he was a
Yeah.
depressive and
Yeah.
seances and sort of looking for something all the time. And you know, maybe that is why he's, I don't know, I'm hardly a psychiatrist, but I would imagine that maybe that's where your imagination can let fly, because it's something very different from your real life. Perhaps there is that. But thank all of you for coming this evening. It really is appreciated by me and also by Stephen.
No,
And
thanks very
thank you
much.
again.
Thanks so much, Jane and Stephen. What a wonderful evening.